It is Free Association on 91.3 FM. We hope you enjoyed that slew of true alternative music that we had coming your way. And now coming our way is Mr. Kevin Klose, the former president of NPR from 1998 to 2008. Currently, he is a professor at the University of Maryland in their College of Journalism. Mr. Klose, thank you for coming by Free Association. We really appreciate the honor.
Mark, a pleasure to be with you.
Let me ask you something. In your estimation, what is the state of public broadcasting?
The state of public broadcasting in the U.S. is terrific. It has extraordinary public support from individuals, families, people of every sort of walk of life in America, and people of every economic strata, of every profession, and from the world of manufacturing, from assembly lines, from truckers, from transport people, from hoteliers, you name it. Both NPR and public radio and public television have very wide support across the political spectrum as well.
Speaking of this support, one thing that intrigued me when looking over your biography is that from 98 to '08, you helped grow NPR's listenership. You nearly doubled it. So my question is, was there a particular business model that you used to double the listenership?
Mark, there were two specific events that related directly to the doubling of the listenership, which went from, these are surveys by Arbitron, which is the national audience survey service independent from NPR. What it showed was in 98, the audience was about 13 million listeners a week nationally. Those are people listening at least once a week. It doesn't add to the numbers if they listen 10 times a week. And that number rose to about 26 million by right around the end of 2007-8. The first thing that happened was there was a series of once-in-a-decade stories that happened year after year after year throughout the first decade of the 21st century. It opened, of course, with the terrible events, the catastrophic events around the attacks of 9/11. Then there was the invasion of Afghanistan by U.S. forces to seek the perpetrators of 9/11. Then came the war in Iraq. Then came Rita and Katrina, devastating that part of the Gulf Coast and New Orleans in particular. In there also was the 2004 election, the presidential election, and so forth and so on. And these events continued to march right through the decade, and they drove the nation's appetite for high-quality news to new levels. That's one thing. The second thing was that public radio, in particular, was putting enormous resources into its capacities to report the news. And that had been a trend which had been slow to grow, but they had never turned back from putting more resources whenever they had them in there. And in the middle of the decade, during my time at NPR, came very, very remarkable jump in financial viability of the NPR, the national service, to the independent stations through phenomenal generosity of Mrs. Joan Kroc, the widow of Ray Kroc, who was the person who really created the McDonald's empire. She died quite sadly, really, at a relatively premature age of 75 from a brain tumor. After having had conversations with me and other people in public radio, she willed more than $200 million to National Public Radio as an endowment and for operating contingency funds. And that was extraordinary in helping NPR grow its news resources.
It really sounds like it. After you left NPR, you're still pretty influential in the world of journalism, helping shape the future minds. That's why you're the dean of the Philip Merrill College of Journalism. So with that being said, what's your take on bias in the news, or the new term they have, advocacy journalism? Is it as bad as some say?
That's a great question, Mark. Very pertinent to our time. There is a great deal of rambunctious, outspoken, overspoken, opinionating in commercial radio and in commercial television. There's nothing wrong with those things. This country has always had a great rambunctious dialogue, one filled with all kinds of ways of characterizing people who have different views, of casting aspersions on such people, of making fun of them, and so forth and so on. And we're also a nation that loves a sideshow. We're attracted to public scandal. We're attracted to private scandal. Even when athletes have misadventures in their private lives that becomes part of the sort of the public dialogue and the public awareness. We like diversion and the kind of contentious or contending kind of dialogue we can find in some reporting or some things that purport to be straight news and are not, just fits into that mold. So it's a kind of sensationalism that's part of who we are. It's part of our national culture. The real thing to say, I think, is that high-quality news has an enormous power to attract both listeners, viewers, and readers. And that's why audiences to public radio have gone up. It's why, while there have been many fractures of audienceships and viewerships because of the multiplicity of new providers in cable, wireless, and elsewhere, there still is an enormous amount of a large listenership, viewership, and readership to quality, centered, factual, independent journalism that is not about advocacy.
This is Mark Lane, joined with Mr. Kevin Klose, the former president of NPR from 1998 to 2008, joining us on Free Association. He was also the president of Radio Free Europe from 1994 to 1997, and during this time, you moved the Radio Free Europe or Radio Liberty operations from Munich to Prague. So what was it that caused that?
Mark, I had 25 years of journalism at the Washington Post before going to the radios in the early 1990s. One of my assignments at the Washington Post was 4 years in Moscow as Moscow bureau chief during the 1970s, which was the last period of real, sort of in some ways, unchallenged Soviet power in its own bloc. Later, when I went to Radio Free Europe, I became the director of the radio services that went back into the former Soviet Union in the early 90s. The reason we moved it to Prague from Munich is that the radios had historically been in Munich because that had been in the American zone of occupation after World War II in southern Germany. And when the wall came down in '89 and the split between East and West started to disappear, it was very clear that Radio Free Europe, if they were going to have a future in the post-Soviet hegemony in Eastern Europe and in Eurasia, the radios as an operating enterprise where its newsrooms should be and its broadcast operation should be further east. And Prague was fairly close to Munich. It's a few hundred miles to the east. So the move there was, I think, very important to the viability of the radios in the post-Soviet era. Why should we even care about it? Because the peoples of Central Europe and the former Soviet Union, many people in those places had aspired to independent journalism, which is part of what people need in self-governing societies. And many of the people in East Europe and in most of Eurasia had never had journalism without state control. And Radio Free Europe is independent, editorially independent, and sets extraordinary standards for verifiable, fact-based journalism in all the major languages in that part of the world. So I thought it was important to move them to Prague, and people here in Washington, D.C. agreed with me in the Congress and in the then White House, which was they are the funders for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which, by the way, is a private 501c3 company chartered in the state of Delaware.
That's interesting to know. I was unaware of that. Thank you for enlightening us. Mr. Klose, one final question. I'm a senior in college and about to enter the real world. So what words would you give to aspiring media cadets like myself and my fellow students out there?
Mark, in my lifetime in journalism, I've dealt with all the major sort of platforms, both contextual text journalism in the Washington Post, contextual radio journalism at National Public Radio, and contextual television, either working with others who are producing television or being interviewed on television. Here's my view. It all begins with the writing.
Bingo! I knew it. Thank you. But continue.
The reason that is because it is the narrative. And the narrative, you still have to describe it what you're after if you're going after video only. If you're going after pictures only with no soundtrack at all, you still need to know what is your concept and what are you trying to capture. And that can be put in text. You can scrawl it with a crayon on a slate. It has to be expressed in some fashion that has words in it. And so that's, in effect, writing, in my view, quotable words. You could ad-lib it into a microphone. Plenty of people do it that way. But it really has to do with the writing because each one of those platforms, and it's true in Twitter, it's true in blogs, it's true on Facebook, it's true wherever. While there are video presentations, there also is the way the narrative runs. And the narrative has to be stated. So it all begins with the writing. I was taught that by Cokie Roberts, one of the great founding enterprising reporters and anchors and hosts at National Public Radio. She said when I asked her, what's the secret to NPR, which does high-quality journalism, she said, why, Kevin, it all begins with the writing.
Yes, I was told that writing is very important by one of my first instructors in my writing for the media class. And, us students, we think we know everything, so we didn't believe her. But the further up I go, the more true that is. Mr. Kevin Klose, thank you for joining us on Free Association.
Mark, it's a pleasure to have been with you. All best to you and to all your listeners.
Thank you. We'll have the weather right after the break and some Modest Mouse. Don't go away.